displeased shake of his head. Those two better not take that nickname to heart. Anyway, Ash began as he tried to change the topic and looked at Steven. I was going to talk to you about how we could keep in touch. He noticed the perked up faces of Steven and Gary and grinned. Heard of the X-Transceiver? It's got its own signal, so if it works across regions, we might be able to keep in touch. It's been pretty hyped up, that thing. Steven nodded and let his lips curl up slightly. Says you can call people even if there's no signal, which is kinda insane. It'll be interesting to see how it goes after launch. Ash's grin widened uncontrollably as he dug into his pocket and revealed the predominantly black, watch-like device. He hadn't used it to its fullest yet, but he'd learned enough playing with its countless features. Yet, it contained things that he could barely make sense of. Gary gasped. You've already got one. He leered at Ash, his eyebrows knitting closer. He clearly wasn't glad that Ash had got one before him. How did you snag one of those? You'd have had your very own had someone not been all, I can't miss the SS. Anne. Ash mimicked Gary's quote mockingly. Noticing Gary's puzzled blinking, Ash added, this is a prototype model of the X-Transceiver which I got from Bill, the guy Professor Oak suggested we visit when we were in Cerulean. Ash briefly relished the widening of Gary's eyes at the revelation before he turned his attention to Steven. Bill said it'll work just as well with the ones in the market after launch. Gary shrugged. I won't say I regret that, even if I am interested in the X-Transceiver. I'm not a very tech-savvy guy, Steven interjected as he removed a red phone-like device from his pocket. But an engineer from my father's company told me that they were working on a deal to have the X-Transceiver technology added into the Pokémon. That looks like a different model from the one I last saw, Ash said, eyeing the Pokémon in Steven's hand. It was one of the Devon Corporation's most popular devices, or at least, that's what he'd heard from Steven. Yeah, Steven chimed, pressing a button to make the Pokémon screen light up, a few icons appearing on it. Ash stepped closer and peered into the screen. He could discern a few common icons like one for a map, phone and chat, and the ones he'd fiddled with when he had his own. But most others were out of his frame of knowledge. I had one of the older ones, but I forgot it at home, Gary said nonchalantly. That was more like the rival Ash knew. Not a care in the world. Not that I used it much, anyway. It's pretty useful in cities and towns since you can make calls with it. Steven smiled wryly, but didn't look too displeased. He shrugged, but to be honest, I don't think I'd miss it too much in the wild. Maps and Pokémon information are also available in Pokédexes. Ash couldn't help but chuckle at the indifferent tone in which Steven had dismissed the Pokémon as ineffective for Pokémon journeys. It was one of his father's company's flagship products, after all. You had the first generation one too, didn't you, Ash? Steven asked, an eyebrow raised. Ash scratched his head sheepishly. He stuttered momentarily but shook it off. It broke. Steven's eyes lit up as he burst into a chuckle. That's not something I'd expect from Ash Ketchum, who always looks after his things. Of course, that was only partly true. Ash would die of shame if he revealed the reason it had happened. He had woken up one morning with the Pokémon lying on the floor of his bedroom in pieces. The metal coating warped from being tossed off his dresser in his sleep like it had been thumped against a rock as hard as diamond. Upon further inspection on it, he remembered that he'd used the thing the night before and fallen asleep with it. And there could have been only one reason that the Pokémon had ended up in that state. He'd probably been dreaming of becoming a Pokémon master and used the poor piece of metal as a substitute for his fantastical Pokéball that held his ferocious Charizard. He knew because that wasn't the only thing he'd smashed in this fashion. Ash shifted his weight on the couch nervously. It fell off of my desk and stopped working and I never got it repaired. I see, Steven mused doubtfully for a moment but let the topic slip by. So, as I was saying, if they do add that X-Transceiver feature to the Pokémon, then it's simple. If they don't, I'll just get an X-Transceiver. Ash smiled at his words. Spoken like a true rich boy, never thinking twice before dumping money into something that he might not even use much. But who was Ash to judge? Sounds good, Ash chirped. He tapped on his X-Transceiver, a string of digits akin to a phone number appearing on the display. This is the ID that you can contact me with. You can note it down for now. Steven nodded, brought his Pokémon over the X-Transceiver screen and tapped a button. The clicking noise indicated the picture capture. Done. Hey, hey, hey. Gary drummed, inadvertently nudging his shoulder roughly against Ash's as he pushed closer. Don't go sharing all of this stuff without me. You can note them down on a piece of paper for now, Gary, Ash suggested, though his words lacked any intentional taunts. Gary didn't see it that way. Not them, Gary scoffed. He waggled his index finger left and right with a click of his tongue. I only want Stevens. Who's even gonna call you? Ash's lips twisted. That stung. Even if he was used to Gary's jibes sometimes, some things hurt. Okay then, he mumbled evenly in an attempt to conceal his feelings. Gary lightly nudged his shoulder against Ash's. Had he noticed Ash's dejection at his words? The oak glanced around airily, his lips parting a few times before he finally mouthed. Well, he said, pausing to look at Ash from the corner of his eye. Maybe, I'll get yours too so you don't feel left out. A devilish smirk suddenly spread across his face. Knowing you, you might feel disheartened about it, and you'd be miserable training your Pokémon. Can't have you be even less of a challenge to me than you already are. Ash blinked at the sea of words that should have made him furious from the venom, but he burst out laughing instead. What was that? He managed between a few chuckles and sniggers. That's the spirit, Gary boomed. Have as much fun as you can before I beat you again. You know that's never going to happen, Ash immediately shot back, although he still grinned fiercely. You guys are a lot of fun, Brock shook his head with great amusement. He'd remained silent through most of their conversations, so Ash was delighted that he'd joined. He'd almost felt guilty about not being able to have Brock integrate with the group as much as he'd have liked. Well, Ash said, at least someone enjoyed that. Brock shrugged, then chuckled. I've been enjoying it for a while now. So have I, Steven chimed. Although, I would have a better time if I knew when you guys were joking and when you were serious. Do you really think I'd ever joke around with Ash? Gary laughed uncontrollably, jerking his head left and right. Gary seemed back to his old self and Ash couldn't be happier about it. The group separated after another few minutes of jokes and the occasional serious conversation but decided to meet again for dinner. Steven uncharacteristically suggested having a movie night before they eventually parted the next day, so that was their plan after dinner. Ash didn't take Steven as someone who'd be too into visual entertainment, but it was a good idea. Not that Ash was particularly excited about it, he wasn't a huge fan of the medium either. He watched a few movies and shows from time to time, but hardly found any to be more enthralling than watching Pokémon battles, even as a child. Ash sat opposite Brock in the room that they shared. Brock had told him he wanted to talk to him about something important. He'd appeared somewhat hesitant, which was unlike the former gym leader. For what little Ash knew about him, anyway. Ash, Brock began, keenly staring at Ash. I told you that I'd be traveling with you for a while. Ash hummed, but he felt a terrible uneasy away at his glee. Yeah, I'm sorry, Ash. Brock's head dipped, his chin almost touching his chest. I won't be able to travel with you right now. Ash's stomach sank, even though he'd concluded it would be something along those lines a few moments ago. There's a Pokemon Doctor's Workshop by Dr. Gianna Joy here in Vermilion that's starting soon. She's one of the best Pokemon doctors around, and I wouldn't want to miss this opportunity. It'll last for about a month and I don't want to slow you down. I'm extremely sorry. Ash let his mind wash off the disappointment, though wisps of it still lingered. No need to apologize, Brock. He forced a weak smile, his shoulders, which had reflexively drooped, hitched up again. This is important to you. We all have different goals, and we need to do our best to reach them. I'd feel guilty if you missed this chance because of me. He stood up and gently placed a comforting hand on Brock's shoulder. He remembered the older boy doing the same for him on multiple occasions. Don't feel upset just because of me. He watched Brock sigh before his lips curled slightly upwards. Thanks, Ash. No, thank you, Ash smiled, stressing the words of gratitude. You've been such a big help with everything. I can't say I won't miss you, though, especially your cooking. I'll make something for you that you can carry, Brock said as his smile turned jovial. Ash chinned up. That'd be great. He was genuinely excited about it. However, he felt a piercing thorn in his heart when he realized that he'd never done a thing for Brock. But, I feel bad that you do so much for me, and I haven't done a thing in return. Ash's gaze drifted downwards. Don't think of it that way, Brock assured him as he playfully ruffled a few strands of Ash's messy, raven hair. Ash shook his hand off with a snicker. Just the feeling is enough. Friends don't do things expecting anything in return. Friends, yes, Brock had been a loyal friend to him, even if their relationship had been brief until now. What started as a battle for the Boulder Badge had already become an irreplaceable bond. Maybe, one day, he'd be able to help Brock or do something for him. Ash gazed at Brock with warm, growing respect. All right, friend. Last night had gone by too soon. Ash stood outside the Pokémon Center as he adjusted his hat, and his friend's heartfelt stares nearly brimmed tears in his eyes. He sighed repeatedly, each longer and more weary than the last. It was time to part, and although a part of him remained enthusiastic about being on a journey again, he'd thoroughly enjoyed traveling. He got to spend a lot more time with his Pokémon while doing so, but he failed to shake off the feeling of sorrow that ached his heart. This is goodbye then, huh? Steven's stare was vacant as it turned from Ash to Gary to Brock and then focused back at Ash. I didn't think you'd be too upset about it, Gary spoke after moments of silence. His shaky smile twitched and twisted every second. Let's not get all emotional and act like girls. Ash found it difficult to conceal his lack of spirit, but his tone hid it well. He glanced at Brock and laughed. Brock might get the wrong impression about us. We don't want that happening now, do we? Steven's expression brightened, his voice finding its vigor. It was great meeting you, Brock. I think I learned a lot from you in the short time we spent together. Brock waved a hand. You think too much about it, but glad to be of help. Steven's eyes twinkled with remarkable ardor. I'd love to meet your dad someday. Ash failed to contain a snicker. He should have figured Steven's enthusiasm would be about something regarding stones. If what little he'd heard about Brock's dad from Serge was true, Steven would come to adore the man. Certainly, Brock nodded. He'd be just as happy to meet someone as enthusiastic about it as you. He doesn't always come across people with as much passion as him too often. Ones who appreciate the magnificence of stones are rare. Steven momentarily shot a cold glare Ash's way, making his chest tighten. So it's always a pleasure to meet them. His expression turned warm again. He glanced at his watch and pursed his lips, but forced a smile right after. I've got to leave now. My car will be here soon. Yeah, Ash raised a fist. Best of luck in the Hoenn League. Steven bumped Ash's fist all too quickly. Thanks, I'll do my best. Of course, you will, Ash grinned. That made him feel a bit better. Steven and Gary did the same. I'll be stronger the next time we fight, so don't slack off. Gary sneered at the silver-haired trainer. Steven chuckled. I won't, and I can't wait to fight you again. Steven turned to Brock and offered him a handshake. See you later, Brock. Brock smiled evenly as he grasped Steven's hand. Yeah, see ya, and have a safe trip. Thanks. With that last word, Steven gazed at Ash and Gary keenly before turning around and walking, his suitcase trailing behind him. And a few moments later, he disappeared in the hustle and bustle of the busy streets of Vermilion. I guess I should be on my way too, Ash said as his smile quivered, his hand scratching his ears then settling in his pockets. He wasn't keen on saying goodbye. Yeah, me too, Gary nodded and tapped his foot on the ground, his stare firmly locked on the floor. Gary had called Professor Oak in the morning, and Ash had joined the call a while later. He was happy to talk to Professor Oak after a while. The researcher didn't spare him a scolding about the lack of contact with him as well as Delia, and the scene had amused Gary more than he'd have liked. Ash had apologized a lot in the last day or so, not something that he minded considering his own faults, but also not something that he wanted to make a habit of. Ash had thought about asking Professor Oak about the glowing feather, but held it back. Not that he didn't trust Gary regarding it, but he felt it'd be best to talk to Professor Oak about it privately, better yet in person. He couldn't be sure, but the thing seemed far too mysterious. Far too important. The sporadic glowing that happened every so often, more so in recent weeks than before, had his stomach flutter with anxiety. There was no way to tell whether that was the feather having a mind of its own, or him feeling uneasy about the mystery surrounding the thing. The odd feeling that the feather had been trying to talk to him continued to grow. He couldn't make sense of whether it was beneficial or foul, but he couldn't shake the feeling that the feather was alive. The professor had also told Gary to visit Bill, and he hadn't denied it this time. So, that was where he was headed. So, you're gonna go to Lavender Town, then head to Celadon. Gary asked aloofly, but Ash sensed the slightest hint of interest in his voice. Yeah, Ash affirmed, waving the fleeting thought of teasing Gary off. He'd been looking forward to a visit to the town, which was home to the largest resting place in the whole of Kanto. It'll probably take a while to get there though. It's pretty far away. After that, I'll probably take a train to Celadon from there. Gary hummed as he tightly clenched his bag's belt. See you guys later, then. Ash gnawed on his lip, struggling to find the words to say to his closest rival. But Gary had him covered. His head turned slightly as he looked at Ash over his shoulder. Take care, Ash. Ash felt the tingling in his stomach at those words. He grinned, unconsciously stepping forwards. You too, Gary, he exclaimed and watched Gary wave over his back before his figure became smaller and finally vanished. Ash sighed and shook his head at the thought of him actually missing Gary traversed his head. He turned to look at Brock. It's time I get going too, his shoulders slumped as his lips curled up. Take care of yourself on your journey. Brock smiled warmly. I'll try to catch up to you in Celadon, but can't be sure if that'll be possible. Don't worry about that, Brock, Ash assured him. Brock apparently still wasn't over the fact that he'd not been able to accompany Ash. You just concentrate on your medical training. I'm sure we'll be able to travel together again sooner or later. You're right, Brock said as he placed both his hands on Ash's shoulders. Goodbye, Ash. Goodbye, Brock, Ash mumbled. A tender handshake followed, and then Ash strode. The thought of isolation stung after spending about a week with some of his closest friends, but he forced the thought away, knowing he had his Pokémon with him. They'd never let him be alone, and his friendship with them was just as close, if not closer. Ash weighed his options. He needed to head to the northeast exit of the city, located farthest away from the Pokémon Center he was at. Walking through the city would take too long and be a waste of time he'd rather use for training, so he took a bus to the northeast exit before making his way onto Route 11. The week that followed went by in a blur from walking through small villages in the wilderness. Of course, training with his Pokémon was a given, and Ash took care to give them enough time to rest and enjoy themselves. He found himself overseeing his training Pokémon in a small clearing surrounded by trees, a perfect spot. He'd rested a day in a small town on his way, but apart from that, it had been a non-stop trek since he left Vermilion. The feelings of loneliness that had swamped him while leaving the port city had barely lasted a few hours. He'd loved having some of the crepes that Brock had baked for him, and Kaiser hadn't let himself be left out. Ash had shared them with all of his Pokémon. Needless to say, they had loved it. Spending some time with his Pokémon, he'd felt refreshed. Some trainer battles on the outskirts of Vermilion brought a rush of adrenaline with each victory. Flurries of scorching flames shot from Ignis' maw, the sweltering heat of the move flaring the air into a heatwave and singeing the grass beneath it. Ash grinned at the sight of the darkened earth as the fire faded into the air, but not before it had turned the few small vegetations around into ashes and undying, scattered embers. Ignis had perfected Flamethrower. As Ash had expected, the move was but an extension of Ember. Once Ignis mustered more flames from within himself, Flamethrower became as natural as breathing for the fire type. Ash had still shown him some clips demonstrating the move, which may have helped in the quick mastery. Ignis roared a victorious cry and pumped his bulging arms. His training for the last couple of days had been about consistently using Flamethrower without sacrificing power. And he'd been successful in doing so. Well done, Ignis, Ash cheered as he strode towards the Charmeleon. He gently petted Ignis, earning himself an affectionate shriek. The searing heat that Ash felt at first touch faded a moment later. Ignis might have become a bit more aloof after his evolution, but he hadn't lost his adoration for his trainer. "We can start working on something else now." Just then, Ash heard an all-too-familiar roar. He turned at the source of it and found Kaiser spitting a stream of flames, hardly comparable in intensity or power to Ignis, towards a tree. Kaiser panted heavily, his chest thumping up and down as the flames vanished. The Dratini had made impressive progress in his own training of Flamethrower. He'd only been at it for a week and the results were spectacular, for Ash, at least. Kaiser didn't look too pleased. His tail slammed on the ground, huffing up dust and debris and etching a mark on the surface. Such was Kaiser's rage as he glared at Ignis. Ash almost shuddered at the intensity of it as Kaiser snarled again, but then looked away. Ignis glared furiously right back and sent a mocking growl at Kaiser. He basked in the petty victory of having a better handle on Flamethrower over Kaiser. "Hey, you two," Ash bellowed, stepping between his two Pokémon. Their relationship had worsened since Ignis' evolution, and he'd been unable to alter its path as it veered towards unhealthy levels. He wouldn't mind if they simply competed, but their rivalry was becoming far too violent and begrudging for his comfort. "Stop fighting all the time," Ash almost ordered, shooting glares at both of them. His voice was bereft of any tenderness that he usually spoke with. He'd hoped that Ignis would help Kaiser in mastering Flamethrower, but his attempts to get him to do that had been futile. That was mostly down to Kaiser's defiance of not wanting Ignis' help. A roar from Kaiser ignored Ash's words, and Ignis wasn't one to shy away from rebutting back. Ash shook his head and sighed deep and long. For the first time since he'd begun his journey with the unruly Kaiser, he was having trouble controlling his Pokémon. He was thankful to Ava, who chirped a resounding shriek and settled herself between Ignis and Kaiser, trying to solve their differences like she always did. He would have been driven mad had it not been for her timely interventions and the occasional ones from Tia, which was a sure but welcome surprise. Tia's quaint nature meant that she disliked conflict, so it wasn't shocking to see her try to resolve their tension. It was more surprising that Ignis and Kaiser listened to her at times. Of course, she wasn't as successful at it as Ava, but her attempts helped nonetheless. A few whizzing slashes of wind that threatened to pierce into Ash's skin caught his attention. Sharp leaves enveloped in pink psychic energy sliced a few branches of a nearby tree paper thin. The ones that missed their mark floated down like feathers a few meters in the distance. A few days back, out of nowhere, Tia had begun to use Magical Leaf. Pokémon learned some moves naturally as they grew, so it wasn't totally surprising. She had still needed practice on accuracy, but her progress in the matter was astounding. She was probably ready to use the move in battles already. "You're doing great, Tia," Ash called out from a distance and walked towards her. "I can't believe how quickly you've got Magical Leaf down." Tia reveled in the praise as her tiny hands clasped together and a faint hue of pink covered her white cheeks. Then, it suddenly happened. A magnificent lustrous glow of energy enveloped Tia and her features grew. Ash gasped and the Pokémon beside him cooed as their attention got enamored by the evolution of their friend. Ash watched Tia's hair grow longer and her red horns shift from the center to either side of her head with breathless zest. Her lower body, which was nearly invisible beneath the white covering of almost coat-like fur, expanded into slender legs as her entire being doubled in size. When the dazzling light died down, Tia emerged with a coo, her innocent, scarlet eyes now visible on either side of the emerald hair that covered her face. The newly evolved Kirlia spread her arms wide and then brought them together, dancing with her green legs as a graceful swirl followed. Ash could barely control his features from grinning as he excitedly hopped over to Tia. "You've evolved," Tia cooed zealously as she skipped towards her trainer and vaulted into him, her arms embracing Ash as she cooed again a few times. Ash stroked Tia's hair gently and enjoyed the psychic type snuggling into him and nudging her head around. He lifted Tia up, earning a squeal before he put her back on the ground. Trooper bolted beside her and squealed. The Kirlia blushed at whatever the Mankey had said to her and her head lowered even further when Ava landed and chirped, then moved to stroke her head with her fluffy wings. Ignis and Kaiser followed soon after, apparently forgetting their rage as they roared what Ash thought were words of praise to Tia. Helio remained the only one not to join the group. The Kabuto whom Ash had told to practice dig with Trooper, and Helio had no qualms about it, opting to watch the scene from a distance. The gathering widened Ash's gleeful smile even more. His team was becoming more and more like a family, each one cherishing the success and growth of another, although Kaiser and Ignis had been having problems lately. As difficult as it may be for him to get those two to work together again, he was sure they'd come around. He just hoped that it would be sooner rather than later. Ash led his Pokémon chatter for a while, which lasted a lot longer than he'd thought. He didn't particularly mind that, however. They deserved the fun that they'd been having and more. The hard work that they'd been putting in, for months now, was paying dividends as they grew, evolved, learned new moves and strengthened the ones they already knew. Yet, they had much, much more room to grow. This was only the beginning. "Let's take a break for lunch, guys," Ash called out to his Pokémon once their excitement subsided to silent chirps and growls as the group separated and returned to training, spitting flamethrowers, shooting blade-like leaves, and punching or swatting the air. It had been hours since they'd started training in the morning. The Pokémon sprawled out across the ground and gazed up at the sky, closing their eyes and huffing their chests up and down. "Thanks for working so hard." The group livened up again at the mention of lunch. His Pokémon surrounded him in little more than a few moments as he removed the packet of Pokémon food from his bag. He'd be running out of it soon. Luckily, there was a town nearby where he could restock. The fruits in the forests that he'd come across had aided in preserving the Pokémon food longer. That was a massive help because if not for that, he wouldn't have been able to carry enough for it to last much. These were the times when he missed Brock most. Regardless, there were always tiny villages between larger towns. Not all of them offered the kind of variety that the towns and cities provided, but he could hardly complain. It was better than not having anything at all. As it had been the case ever since his capture, Helio refused to show too much movement outside of battle. He'd been sitting on that same spot with no care for food or anything else. Usually, Ash had to either carry him to the group, or one of Trooper, Tia or Ava would call him and he'd listen. But Ash decided to go and grab the shellfish Pokémon himself, not wanting to have his tired Pokémon do the work. He wasn't that far away, anyway. Time for lunch, Helio, Ash said and stopped in front of the Kabuto. As usual, Helio's response was an empty glare, devoid of sound. Not again. It wasn't unexpected, but Ash felt disappointment fill his heart each time Helio ignored him. Ash shook his head in defeat, then lethargically bent down and lifted Helio up. He wasn't very aggressive, so Ash didn't feel hesitant about approaching him. He'd barely walked halfway to the group when he silently cursed and thought it would have been better to ask one of his Pokémon to call him over. Helio's firm, rocky body probably weighed around 25 pounds, but Ash felt he'd been lifting a boulder at least double the size. When Ash reached the others, he remained careful of putting Helio down gently. His hands dipped to his knees as he panted profusely, sharp and deep breaths that made him collapse on the ground. He shook his head amusedly at the sight of Helio finally moving on his own and crawling towards his bowl. Ash couldn't wait to have him open up more. Thick, foggy mist obscured even the ground and nearby trees. However, Ash could feel where he wanted to go. The path that he needed to take reeled him forward like he